Well, this week in your reading and group discussion, we're talking all things money. Now, some of us immediately sit up and we lean in because we want some real sound input. We really do want to know how to handle it, relate to it, and use it in a way that works for us. We're open to hearing God's perspective. We're just not really sure what to do. Now, I wish I had heard more about money management principles when I was growing up. I could have avoided some mistakes and saved a lot of time and literally money. Others of us maybe hear this is the topic and we're not really too interested in it and we think it's mostly a personal matter. Well, wherever you find yourself on the subject, there's no doubt we're bombarded by thousands of messages every single day asking for money, telling us how to use it, how to get more of it, and maybe even worship it. It might surprise you to know that Jesus talked about money more than anything else. 25% of his teachings involved money. Almost half of his parables have insights on the subject. He actually talked about money more than faith and prayer and heaven and hell combined. Now, there are, at a minimum, I believe, at least 3 truths throughout the scriptures that we need to know. That if we could wrap our minds around that and think differently about money, maybe we could act differently with our money. So here we go. Number 1, God is the owner of everything. Jesus told a story that we read in the book of Matthew, chapter 25. It was part of your reading for the week, so I'll summarize. A business owner was going to be gone for a while, so he left things in the hands of 3 managers. He gave them different amounts of money to manage, hoping that they would take good care of it. And 2 of those managers invested it. And when the owner returned, he saw that they had managed well and they were trusted with more responsibility. Well, one of the managers was afraid and a little nervous, and he didn't do anything. And the owner took his responsibility away from him. Now, the way Jesus tells the story, it's clear that the owner represents God, and you and I are represented by the managers. Now, each of the managers in the story gets their money from the same place. They get it from the owner. It's not theirs, it's his. Like everything's on loan. And this is the foundational truth to all other truths, that God is the owner of everything. You came into the world that way. You came with nothing. You were born naked. You were ugly. Your head was humongous. You had nothing. And when you die, your stuff stays here as well. We're not taking anything with us. We are, for all practical purposes, borrowing. Like everything you have and I have, you and your life, it's all on loan. So if God's the owner of everything, then nothing I have is really mine. Now, this is not a new concept for most of us. When our oldest daughter, Jessica, was probably 8 years old or so, I took her to the movies. Now, we didn't normally spend money at the concession stand back then, but on this occasion, we actually did. And she got a bag of Skittles, and I bought something else because that's what you do. You get options. And we're sitting down for the movie to begin, and I reach over to her bag, and I say, "Give me some of those." And she pulls the bag back away from her and says, "No." And I say, "What? Well, wait a second, why not?" She says, "They're mine." To which I reply, "No, actually, they're mine. I'm pretty sure I just bought them. I paid for them with my money. It was a gift to you." And in the same way, you and I don't really own anything. Number 1, God's the owner of everything, which means you and I are managers of the resources we've been entrusted with. Managers do their best to spend, save, invest, and give in a way that reflects the desires of the owner. There's a sense of responsibility that comes when you're managing someone else's stuff. And maybe you've stayed at an Airbnb before. If so, you'll know that there's an agreement to care for that place. There might be an arrival and a departure checklist, how to operate the TV, where to find kitchen utensils, how you should actually leave the bedding when you depart. There are things that you can and cannot do that reflect the desires of the owner. And you want to take care of it well so you can be entrusted to use that service in the future. Truth number 1, God's the owner of everything. You and I are managers. Truth number 2, heart always follows money. This comes directly from Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, specifically Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, where he says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Now, Jesus isn't saying this is a bad thing necessarily, or even a good thing. It's just a thing. It doesn't mean that it should be or it shouldn't be. It's just true. There's a powerful connection between money and our heart. As money goes, so goes our attention and our affection. Again, you understand this. If you've ever bought a new car before, how you use 2 parking spaces, no one's allowed to eat in it. No one really rides in it. You certainly don't let your teenagers learn how to drive with it. You make space in the garage for it, and you probably even give it a name. That first scratch might as well have been like a knife in your own heart. So we put a lot of money into that, and so now we're invested emotionally. If you dabble in stocks, you watch those things really closely. I may not have any idea what the company does, but I hope they do better, right? Google, Apple, PayPal, American Eagle, you're suddenly consumed and protective. You're looking for those products everywhere. You're checking the app constantly because you invested money and your heart has followed. Some of us will connect with this. Last year, Americans spent a record $103.6 billion on our pets. So naturally, we treat them with extra special care. Our hearts are invested in them because our money is invested in them. I read recently that in 40 states, among the highest paid public employees were college football coaches. We paid money for facilities and budgets. We're accounting for wins and losses, aren't we? We're giving you the money, and so we have expectations. Saturday in the South is like a religious experience for many. Why? Our heart is there because we're invested. This is also true in other ways. If you've ever sponsored a child in another country, maybe through an organization like Compassion, if you've ever visited another country before and you know people there, or you've taken a mission trip to another place, when I hear that the president of a certain country has been assassinated, or there's a hurricane or a disaster or a tragedy of some kind, I pay attention. I've been to those places. I've sent my resources there. Part of my heart is there. This is also why debt is so painful for some of us. Is anybody paying for something that you don't want anymore? Or maybe you have some regrets over something that you decided to purchase? You bought something, or you had to have it, and your heart went somewhere in the past. It may not be there anymore, but now your money is spoken for and you're serving that thing. So when you write that check or you schedule that payment, it can feel like a piece of your heart being ripped out. Which is why Jesus then says just after that statement, you can't serve 2 masters. You'll either hate one or love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Simply put, he says you cannot have 2 bosses. Eventually, they will be in conflict with one another. Now, God and money don't seem to be opposites. I might expect Jesus to say you can't serve God and Satan, or you can't love God and also love another God. But he says God and money. Why? Well, because your heart and your money are linked together. So here's the question. What could it look like if we led our hearts towards God's kingdom and his desires? How can I put myself in the best position so I can respond to what he wants done and what he says is good and right? In other words, if money reveals what I love and my heart follows my money, why don't we go ahead and tell our hearts where to go and what to do, knowing that if we put God first with our money, our hearts will follow? This is the essence of generosity, which is truth number 3. That generosity links me together with God. You might know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain was a farmer and he brought some crops to God as an offering. His brother Abel was a rancher and he brought the first and his very best, a firstborn lamb, to God as an offering. God was pleased and looked on favor with Abel's offering, but not with Cain. So Cain became jealous, he was angry, and eventually killed his brother. From this story on, a pattern starts developing. A standard essentially has been set where God is asking people to honor him with their first and best. Here's an instance. You read this in the book of Leviticus chapter 27. It says, every 10th of the land's produce, grain from the soil, fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It's holy to the Lord. Every 10th animal from the herd or flock which passes under the shepherd's rod will be holy to the Lord. Now, maybe you've heard that word before, the word tithe, which means 1/10. It is giving the first and the best. 10 ears of corn at harvest, the first one, right? The first ear of corn, an act of generosity to God, and 9 ears of corn for our family. A shepherd holding out his staff, counting off 10 calves, first little calf over there in act of generosity to God, 9 little calves for our family. That offering, it says, was holy. It was set aside to be used for God's purposes. Whether it was sheep, cows, corn cobs, dollars, for every 10 harvested, birthed, or received. Before doing anything else, set aside the first and best as an offering to God. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, wow, that would be a really big step, well, yes, it would. You actually read this later in Proverbs where God attaches his part to the equation. It says this, honor the Lord with your possessions and with the first produce of your entire harvest. Then your barns will be completely filled and your vats will overflow with new wine. Now, this is a really big deal, right? Because a storm might come in and ruin your crop. Some kind of a pestilence might destroy an invading nation. You need to live off of that. And you're not sure how many calves you're going to get, right? The first one is important. I mean, you probably tell your kids not to get to know that one because that one's going to the Lord. The fear of being generous first is that we might not have enough for ourselves, which is why it's important to notice that if we're generous first, that's when God guarantees to take care of us. It's a big step of trust to give first. But he says, if you honor me first, I'll provide for you. And Jesus said it this way later in the Sermon on the Mount, seek first my kingdom and my righteousness, and then, same principle, then all these other things will fall into place. Well, when you reach the end of the Old Testament, God was pretty unhappy with people because rather than giving to him their first and their best, people were giving to him out of their leftovers. It seems like some of the shepherds were going out to the corner of the field, and instead of finding the best lamb, they were giving the crippled one, leaning on the fence like one baha from death. Hey, here's my offering, God. Look at my generosity. Or some farmers, it appears, instead of gathering up the best corn, they were actually giving the grain that had bugs in it and saying, here you go, God. Here's my offering. And God responded essentially by saying, I don't want your lame, blind sheep. I don't want your rotten grain, your spoiled fruit. I don't need your money. I don't want your stuff. I want giving from your heart. You see, God wants so much more than our finances, but our finances are a picture of our heart. He says that he wants to be first in our lives. I don't want to be an afterthought. Don't go after everything you want and then see what you have left. But honor me with the first and the best. And when we give first, we're proving that God is first. See, generosity was a way that God established for people to determine and show their priorities. Think about it this way, right? Every week or every 2 weeks, you likely have a payday. And try to picture yourself when you receive that payday like you have a pie in front of you and you begin to divide up the pie. Now, one way to do this is to believe that you're the owner and you make decisions based on what you want to do. And you have your priorities, right? You cut a big slice for your mortgage or your rent. You'll cut a slice for your car, maybe your utilities, your phone. We cut a slice for debt. We cut a slice for food and eating out and entertainment. And then maybe you have all these other things too, right? Netflix and Hulu and Apple TV and YouTube. And you got slices you cut for your sports and activities and braces. And maybe at the end, if we look at it, we throw God a leftover. Imagine having God over for dinner, right? But serving his plate last. The food runs out right before it gets to him. So you go to the refrigerator and you scrape together some leftovers. Now, whenever we have guests for dinner, I typically make a trip to the store that day. I try to get something that might be just for them. Now, we already have food in the house, right, most of the time, but I want it to be special for them. We could serve up plenty of leftovers, but it's appropriate to honor them with the first and the best of a new meal. That's one approach, right? The other approach is to believe that God is the owner and we choose to steer our hearts in his direction and practice generosity first. So the very first slice of that pie is reserved for him. When I do that, I've now established that I'm trusting God to take care of the rest. God, help me to make it work, to trust you where my worry is prone to take over. Now, people who give to God last or maybe out of leftover are not necessarily greedy people. It's just on most occasions we haven't come to terms with much of what we've already established, that God is owner and we are managers. Now, those who are able to give to God first are generally people who have come to the conclusion that God's responsible for my life and I'm going to trust him for the rest. Now, you might say, well, I would never be able to do that, give first. What God was doing was providing a way for people to train themselves, right? To train themselves to put him first and make him a priority. You have this reminder that you are dependent on God for everything you need. So I want to encourage you to consider taking these next steps. Think about this passage, 2 Corinthians chapter 9. It says, each person should do as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or out of compulsion, since God loves a cheerful giver. Written by the Apostle Paul, follower of Jesus, he's talking about giving to your local church to invest in people's lives, in your community, and around the world. And he says giving is a heart decision. It's not about guilt. It's not complicated. Just find a way to put your heart in position so you can be happy when you give. Now, here's two things you should consider doing. Number one, start with making a decision. He says, decide in your heart. It doesn't matter if you're in high school or you're single, whether you have a lot or you don't feel like you have very much. You're just getting started by making a decision. You decide in your heart. Doesn't matter who you are or how much you make, decide in your heart that you want to be generous and to seek the things of God. Now, if you can do that much, the rest of how it all works out will follow. Number two is to make a plan, right? Make a plan to set aside the first of whatever you have for generosity. Make a plan to give first. It's the only way to guarantee that you'll be generous. Now, here's a simple plan you can follow. Number one, you might just give something. If you've never practiced generosity, give something, but rearrange things so that you do that very first. Now you might move to giving regularly. This kind of thing's very easy to do through our website or maybe the app if you have the church app, but to give regularly, consistently, get in the habit of not just one time, but consistent giving. And then maybe you'll move to percentage giving. You just pick a percentage and start there and figure out how much you make and then kind of adjust it around that percentage. Pick 1, pick 3, pick 5. Maybe you would eventually move up to the tithe of 10%. But what Paul's communicating is that something from the heart is better than nothing. And here's what's going to happen for you. All of these three truths are going to come together in the end for you. You'll be reminded that God is the owner of everything and you're a manager of what you've been given. You'll start to find that your heart is invested in those things and those places and those people that you've been generous with. And finally, you'll be learning to trust God to provide for you. If you have any questions about what we've talked about in this video or during this week in your Rooted discussion, or any week when we stand up on the stage and ask you to practice generosity, by all means, let us know. We'd love to have that conversation with you. You can simply email us at connect@4camden.com.